want to introduce Professor Michael Bryant and welcome you all with my class in attendance, Holocaust in the Arts. So, Professor Michael Bryant, no stranger to DC, he has come here to talk about Mein Kampf when we co-edited a book on it. And he has been in our films and in our book on Mein Kampf, so he's no stranger to us. And we've asked him today to come to speak about Kristallnacht, which we're doing. So graciously, the Center for Christian Jewish Learning said they will help set everything up for us, so I'm grateful to them. And also the Jewish Studies program, and for our class, the Film Studies program. So let me give you an idea of Professor Michael Bryant from Bryant University. I would say that he is the closest to understanding World War II, the consequences of it, the criminal activities involved in it, and the justice system. And Professor Bryant, at Bryant University, teaches courses related to this. His books, I'll mention a few of them. He's also someone who, when he teaches at Nuremberg for the summers, he's able to bring in a perspective that is, a very, very legal, first of all, and humane, and concerned about what happened in World War II, the consequences of it. And in our film on Nazi law, he did speak about the nuances of the Nuremberg trials, 1945-46. So some of Professor Bryant's works are these, and we have worked before on this, and I'm very pleased that he continues his work. He will be speaking in a similar way to Brandeis University on Thursday. And two of the books that I think are very important: Confronting the Good Death, Nazi Euthanasia on Trial, 1945-53, and Eyewitness to Genocide, the Operation Reinhardt Death Camp Trials, 55-66. But he's also written other things, very comprehensive works, World History of War Crimes, and in 2020 he published Nazi Crimes and Their Punishment, and in 2021, Comparative Law, Global Legal Traditions. So with his background in a legal formation and a historical formation in terms of understanding World War II, the consequences, and the legal system in place, he is very suited to be talking about Kristallnacht. And 1 month earlier, October 7th, 2023, we have seen a pogrom that is very, very similar, that could evoke some of the same issues. When Hamas entered into Israel and killed 1,400 innocent citizens. And people have talked since that time, during this past month, that this is the closest thing we have come to the violence experienced in the Holocaust. And at the same time, we're very concerned about the humanity of this conflict, because with 1,400 Israelis and up to 10,000 Gazans, innocent civilians who have lost their lives, we feel there is a connection to what we've seen in the Holocaust. And when we say never again, we realize that it's been never, never again. It has continued through genocides, through our history, through ethnic cleansing, through massacres, through violence against the Jewish community. And we see the suffering of both the Muslim and Jewish communities, because they are both Semitic people. So we are concerned about that here at Boston College, and we want to express are concerned about this conflict. So we put that as a core issue in our society today, and want to introduce this type of lecture to show us, how this had happened earlier in 1938. So I'd like to welcome Professor Michalczyk.
Thank you, Professor Michalczyk, for your generous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be back on campus after a couple of years to be with you all this evening. Welcome to everybody. Thank you for being on hand for my presentation this evening. It's a somber occasion whenever you commemorate an event like the November 1938 pogrom, and the fact that you are here indicates that you recognize the importance of this commemorative event. You understand that Kristallnacht was an extremely important phase, an important chapter of the Holocaust, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this evening. I've been thinking a great deal as of late about Kristallnacht, and specifically about the lessons of the pogrom. What does Kristallnacht tell us about Hitler's thinking? What is its connection to Nazi Jewish policy? What does the pogrom indicate about how Nazi Jewish policy changed? And what role did the pogrom play in that change? What were the linkages, if any, between the pogrom of November 1938 and the final solution, when it became official Nazi Jewish policy by 1941 and 1942? Some historians, and I'm thinking in particular of the German Holocaust historian Peter Longerich, have cautioned us to avoid drawing firm conclusions about Nazi Jewish policy based on the stated intentions of Nazi leaders. Instead, these historians assert the progress of Nazi Jewish policy depended on the flow of circumstance that pushed Nazi policy toward ever greater degrees of radicalization. As we think today about the pogrom and its significance, I would like to challenge, however subtly, this view of the interaction of intention and circumstance. I would suggest that Nazi Jewish policy, while affected by circumstances that radicalized it, was nonetheless driven by the malicious intentions of Hitler and his followers. These intentions, I would suggest, are clear from historical evidence. As always in the real world, human intentions unfold amidst a force field of sometimes chaotic circumstances that open and shut doors to the realization of human purposes. In the end, the vagaries of circumstance created opportunities for the Nazis' malevolent plans for the Jews to be realized, while also supercharging their malice toward them. Kristallnacht was a vital contributor to this process of radicalization. As I will show, the pogrom marks a new and decidedly ominous phase in Nazi Jewish policy. The changes Kristallnacht introduced would define Nazi policy through the end of the 1930s and into the early 1940s, drawing Hitler ever nearer as circumstances on the ground shifted to the end point of Nazi evil, the final solution. We have no evidence of Hitler's anti-Semitism prior to September of 1919. The earliest proof of his hatred for Jews is a letter he wrote, dated September 16, 1919, to a correspondent named Adolf Gemlich. In this letter, the young Hitler distinguished between two different kinds of anti-Semitism: the anti-Semitism of emotion and the anti-Semitism of reason. The anti-Semitism of emotion consisted of violent, wildcat attacks on Jews. This was the violence of the pogrom, carried out by private actors. In his letter, Hitler advised against this type of anti-Semitism because, he wrote, it was short-lived and ineffective in excluding Jews from society. Hitler contrasted the anti-Semitism of emotion with the anti-Semitism of reason. The second type of anti-Semitism was, Hitler wrote, based on, quote, the recognition of facts, unquote, and would achieve a political and a legal solution to the Jewish question. By removing Jews' legal equality, this kind of anti-Semitism would effectively drive Jews from German society. In his letter to Gemlich, Hitler threw his support behind this political and legal form of anti-Semitism. Two important features emerge for our purposes from Hitler's letter. First, we encounter Hitler's belief that pogroms and wildcat violence are to be rejected in favor of a gradual but deliberate removal of Jews from mainstream society. This segregation would be pursued through law, and specifically the revocation of Jewish civil rights. Second, Hitler's hostility toward Jews is clear in his letter to Gemlich. He insists the Jews are an inbred race. Again, this is language that Hitler uses in his letter to Gemlich. An inbred race devoted to their self-enrichment at the expense of non-Jews. The Jews, he writes, are, quote, the racial tuberculosis of the peoples, unquote. It is for this reason that the permanent removal of Jews from society is so urgent for Hitler. Hitler's thinking was remarkably consistent in its acrimony toward Jews in the early 1920s. In the party platform of February 1920, Hitler and his followers declared that the Jews should be deprived of their full civil rights and given a legal status approximating that of non-citizens. Such a position was fully consistent with his anti-Semitism of reason set forth in his letter to Gemlich. Other evidence related to Hitler's anti-Semitism during this period points in a far darker direction, and I would invite all of us to consider the following. First is Hitler's interview given to a Munich law student in August of 1920. In this interview, Hitler called Jews a bacillus that had to be, quote, eradicated from the body of Germany, unquote. He declared that in a situation of duress, such as Germany faced, no life should be spared if necessary to save the life of society, especially the life of the Jews. Hitler also gave in 1920 an interview to a journalist named Joseph Hell. And according to Hell, Hitler said during this interview that when he gained power, he would annihilate the German Jews. He said he would conduct public hangings of Jews in Munich and then throughout Germany until no Jews remained in Germany. This may sound like Hitler is warning of a pogrom, but it is not a classical pogrom because Hitler envisioned that the government, not a private party or private group of individuals, but the government with himself at the head would lead the hangings. This reflects his belief that the sovereign authority could act as he pleased, that is, to act without restraint. I'll come back to that theme here shortly, since I think it's really important for understanding Hitler's anti-Semitism. 3 years later, in September of 1923, Hitler gave an interview to a Catalonian journalist named Eugène Jamar, in the course of which he told Jamar that the best solution to the so-called Jewish problem was to murder the Jews in the night. This could not be done, however, he said, because of negative international reactions that would surely follow from such an act. And thus, for this reason, he told Jamar the only option was mass expulsion. In July of 1924, Hitler was a prisoner in the Landsberg prison after unsuccessfully trying to overthrow the Weimar Republic in the Beer Hall Putsch in November 1923. And as he sat in prison, he gave yet another interview in which he said that he thus far had been too mild in his dealings with the Jews. He vowed that in the future, quote, the harshest means of combat, unquote, had to be used against Jews. This was, for Hitler, in his own words, an existential question, because the Jews were, he claimed, the plague of the world, unquote. Well, in addition to the interviews which Hitler gave in the early 1920s, we also find violent attitudes towards Jews in Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, where he portrays the Jews as agents of disease and death. Hitler calls them the poisoners of the world. He says in quite infamous language that some of you may have encountered before, I don't know, but he said in Mein Kampf that the victory of Jewish Marxism would be the funeral wreath of the human race. So in Mein Kampf, the threat posed by Jews is no longer just a national threat to Germany, but instead has become a planetary threat. And thus, all means used to address this threat were legitimate, according to Hitler in Mein Kampf. There is no explicit statement of an intention to exterminate the Jews in Mein Kampf. This aside, the text brims with intimations of genocide. So too do Hitler's speeches given between 1925 and 1930. In many of these speeches, Hitler asserted that Germany can only experience national renewal when the Jews were removed. In his view, the Jews were to be blamed for every problem, every setback, every catastrophe that befell Germany. In one such speech given to his followers, Hitler proclaimed the Jews had already infected, quote, the body of the people and poisoned its blood. He then warned that if he came to power, he would use his control over the majority of the population to, quote, eradicate the Jews in a legal manner. Let me repeat that. Eradicate the Jews in a legal manner, unquote. I think Hitler's language here is quite revealing. It bespeaks Hitler's concept of law, namely that whoever had sovereign authority could legally form the state in accordance with his wishes. When he later became chancellor in early 1933, he would fully realize his idea of absolute sovereign power by overthrowing the Weimar Republic and establishing himself as the supreme ruler. Thereafter, in accordance with his legal theory, any atrocity he committed, no matter how extreme, was legal by virtue of its conformity with his will. So let's take stock for a moment of my argument thus far. Through the 1920s into the 1930s, Hitler wavered between what he called an anti-Semitism of reason and an anti-Semitism of emotion. While he wrote in his letter to Gemlich that the anti-Semitism of reason was preferable, Hitler never quite overcame his attachment to pogrom violence. I would suggest that this tension between the two kinds of anti-Semitism within Hitler's mind is resolved in his conception of law. According to this concept, the sovereign can do what he wants, a view that circles back to pogrom violence, but now it's pogrom violence with the backing of the sovereign power. I believe this alignment of the so-called anti-Semitism of reason with the anti-Semitism of emotion will be consummated in the November pogrom of 1938, Kristallnacht as it's called. At that point, the seeming opposites are going to coincide, and the government will henceforth identify itself with officially endorsed pogrom violence. Hitler and the Nazis strode toward Kristallnacht through three waves of anti-Semitic repression in the 1930s. The three waves each reflect the duality between the anti-Semitisms of reason and emotion in Hitler's thinking about the Jewish question. Each also demonstrates the conversion of Hitler's malicious intentions toward Jews into government policy. The first wave began in March of 1933. It is helpfully viewed in the context of Hitler's efforts to seize power and consolidate his control after he became chancellor in January of 1933. Among the initiatives Hitler pursued after becoming chancellor, he sought to destroy his opposition. The creation of the first concentration camp, Dachau, in March 1933 was established for this purpose. This was followed by a wave of attacks on German Jews in March 1933. Stormtroopers attacked Jews in the streets, smeared Jewish-owned businesses with Stars of David, and demanded the public avoid shopping in Jewish stores. These assaults, while serious, were not quite at the level of true pogrom violence. Most of the attacks temporarily subsided, while Hitler sought passage of the Enabling Act. Once that was enacted, the attacks resumed, and both official and unofficial persecution of Jews rippled across Germany. These included the boycott of Jewish-owned stores scheduled for April 1st of 1933. It was a boycott led by the stormtroopers, the SA, and the Hitler Youth. In addition to the boycott, the Nazi government passed anti-Jewish laws, such as the Civil Service Law, passed on April 7th, 1933, which removed Jews from the upper level of the civil service and affected roughly 1/2 of the 5,000 Jewish civil servants in the Reich at that time. Its significance, however, was greater than this, or greater than it may first appear, because it really marked the revocation of Jewish legal equality in Germany. Also passed in April of 1933 was the law on the Public Health Service, which cut off Jewish doctors and dentists from public health subsidies if they treated Aryan patients. On April 25th of 1933, the law against overcrowding of German schools was passed. This law restricted the numbers of Jewish students in German universities. In addition to these laws passed in April of 1933, there were other informal actions to rid German cultural life of Jewish influence, which spread throughout the country. By mid-April 1933, most universities had launched so-called actions against the un-German spirit. And of course, for the Nazis, the un-German spirit was represented by Jews. Members of the Nazi Student League poured through library collections, assembled work by Jewish authors, leftist writers, and pacifists, all of whom were denounced as, quote, morally corrupting writers, unquote. These books were then publicly burned. Note that in July of 1933, this first wave of persecution will begin to wane. At this time, Hitler announced the end of the Nazi Revolution. He then moved to rein in the SA, whose wildcat violence and growing membership were becoming problems for Hitler. The second half of 1933 into 1934 was a period of relative quiet for German Jews. Hitler shelved laws he had planned to pass, including what would later be called the Nuremberg Laws. The law on repression ended in 1935, and this was chiefly because by this time Hitler had emasculated the SA and consolidated his control over most German institutions, including local government. He was free now to seek a more thorough and lasting segregation of German Jews from non-Jewish society. During the second wave of Jewish persecution, we witness again this clash between the anti-Semitisms of reason and emotion playing out and affecting Nazi policies toward the Jews. Already in 1934, violence had erupted across Germany, carried out by party activists who renewed their attacks on Jewish stores. They also harassed mixed marriages, demanding through loudspeakers that such unions be dissolved. Some Nazi officials had grave misgivings about these actions, as did the German population as a whole. Even top Nazi officials like Hitler were concerned that wildcat violence would undermine Hitler's efforts to improve foreign relations with Great Britain. He had signed a naval agreement with Great Britain on June 18th of 1935. At the same time, more moderate figures within the right government feared how attacks on Jews would affect foreign trade during a time when Germany was still recovering from the Great Depression. Nonetheless, Nazi radicals pressed for more vigorous anti-Semitic actions. The Hitler Youth attacked Jews in the streets of Berlin during this period. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, was a major instigator. In July of 1935, he published a violent diatribe against Jews in his magazine Angriff. On the same evening as this article appeared, crowds of Nazis gathered in Berlin to riot against Jews. This riot kicked off a new wave of wildcat violence against Jews throughout the country. Jews were expelled from public swimming pools, Jewish stores were blockaded, and everywhere anti-Semitic signs went up. So-called race defilers, or people in mixed marriages, were attacked. The Nazi government tried to staunch the violence by reducing many of the extremist demands to law. This was the context then for passage of the Nuremberg Laws in September of 1935. What did the Nuremberg Laws do? Well, primarily, they banned sexual relations between German Jews and so-called Aryans. Jews were stripped of their full civil rights, as was originally demanded in the party platform of 1920. As German historian Peter Longerich says, passage of the Nuremberg Laws did not put a final end to the street violence of party radicals. Instead, it merely postponed such violence to a later day. That day, as we will see, was November 9th, 1938, the day of the Kristallnacht pogrom, the point at which unplanned circumstance reared its head and interacted with Hitler's malicious intentions. This third wave of Nazi repression of the Jews occurred at the same time as Hitler was preparing to go to war. It was touched off by a coarse anti-Semitic tirade by Hitler at the party day in 1937. The goal of the third phase was to deprive Jews of their rights, to seize their property, and finally to drive them out of Germany. The goal of segregation was now being abandoned in favor of expulsion. Massive pressure was exerted on Jews to immigrate, especially in Austria, which was now a part of Germany, after the Anschluss in March of 1938. In May of 1938, party activists in Berlin stepped up their attacks on Jews, including on stores and Jewish law offices. A mood conducive to pogroms stole over Berlin, fomented by Goebbels, who wanted to use these attacks to force Jews to leave Germany. Hitler ordered Goebbels' action to be halted on June 21st, 1938, because he was planning his move on Czechoslovakia and wished to avoid negative international publicity. Once the Munich Agreement was signed in the fall of 1938, party radicals resumed their anti-Semitic agitation. Their attacks on Jews coincided with the regime's seizure of Jewish property. By the summer of 1938, the skies were lowering for German Jews. Jewish property was being expropriated, Jews were being physically assaulted, and many were being driven out of Germany. A pogrom mood gripped Nazi party activists. This was the situation in Germany during the months leading up to the pogrom of November 1938. I think that we are at this point in a position to talk about Kristallnacht. It was triggered by the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris, Ernst von Rath, by a Jewish assassin, Herschel Grynszpan. On the same day that von Rath died, the Nazi-controlled German press blamed the death on world Jewry. The pogrom itself was launched on November 9th, 1938, set in motion by a speech given by Goebbels to an assembly of Nazi leaders gathered in Munich. They were there to commemorate the anniversary of the beer hall putsch. Hitler was also there. It's unclear what Hitler's role was, but it seems likely that he ordered Goebbels to launch the pogrom. After his incendiary speech, the Nazi officials at the meeting called SA offices in their districts and pressed them to retaliate against Jews for von Roth's death. And we all know what happened next. Synagogues and Jewish homes and stores were attacked, vandalized, and in many cases burned to the ground. Jews were physically assaulted. 91 German Jews were killed or died during the pogrom. 26,000 were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. They were freed only if they agreed to leave the country. The German public reacted passively to the pogrom. And I would suggest that this really was a victory for the Nazis, who saw that they could mistreat Jews publicly and with impunity. Pogroms, of course, had occurred throughout European history for many, many hundreds of years, arguably for millennia prior to this time, and yet none had a more fateful influence on the fate of Jews than Kristallnacht did. Shortly after the pogrom, meetings of top Nazi leaders were held to discuss the situation of the German Jews. Reinhard Heydrich, fellow pictured here on the right, he would be the future head of the Reich Security main office. He emerges at this time as a key figure in Nazi Jewish policy. On November 12th of 1938, Heydrich presents his plan for dealing with German Jews. He called for a total solution to the Jewish question by means of immigration. Over the next 2 years, Heydrich's office and its Jewish department would develop a comprehensive expulsion plan that would become the Third Reich's official Jewish policy. It was official German policy when World War II began. Other than reorienting Nazi Jewish policy toward immigration and expulsion, what were the effects of the pogrom? One immediate result was empowerment of the Nazi regime. The Nazis saw that they could deprive the Jews of all of their rights without public backlash. The Nazi policy of segregation and grudging toleration of a diminished Jewish presence in Germany was now over. The new policy emerging from the pogrom was to strip German Jews of their property and expel them. I would suggest today a second result of the pogrom, namely that the dichotomy between the anti-Semitism of reason and the anti-Semitism of emotion was now dissolved. For the first time, Hitler's government publicly approved of radical measures against Jews as expressions of the German people's rage. Hitler and other Nazi leaders no longer distanced themselves from pogrom violence. The anti-Semitism of reason, of laws and politics now coincided with the violent anti-Semitism of emotion. The Nazi government threw its official backing behind arbitrary pogrom-style violence against Jews. At this point, the fate of Jews in Germany teetered on a knife's edge. The German Jews could suffer no further deprivations. Everything that could have been done to them really had been done to them up until this point, with the exception of exterminating the Jews. And as we all know, under the radicalizing effects of the war, the Nazis will, of course, take this step into genocide in 1941 and 1942. I would like to wrap up my talk and go to a little question and answer with you, if I might. But I want to emphasize a couple of points before I do. A couple of points that I think are essential to understanding Hitler's intentions as expressed in Nazi Jewish policy. Whether in Germany before 1939 or in other European countries invaded by Germany after 1939, Jews were, time and again, used as pawns to advance the Nazis' interests. Depriving Jews of their jobs opened careers in law, the civil service, medicine, and universities to non-Jewish Germans. Often, local Nazis exploited their connections to acquire positions that had once been held by German Jews. The same goes for the process of what the Nazis called Aryanization, which forced Jews to liquidate their assets at bargain basement prices. The resources plundered from Jews were then directed into Hitler's military buildup, preparing the country for war. Historian Peter Longerich argues persuasively that the Nazis' insistence that the Jewish question pervaded all of German society and that the Nazi government alone had exclusive authority to deal with it significantly empowered Hitler's dictatorship. In short, Hitler used his control of the Jewish question, as the Nazis called it, to create a totalitarian government in the 1930s. It was this government, its power raised to absolutist levels, that would instigate World War II and launch Germany into mass murder and genocide. Hitler's Jewish policies enabled the Third Reich to seize control of Germany and start the war. Nazi Jewish policy, thus, was not a grotesque byway of Nazi policy. It was the criminal highway of their achievements, the main road down which all of their other crimes traveled. There's a second point, too, that I think bears mentioning. The persecution of the Jews up to and including the final solution was the result of Hitler's malignant intentions. The plan from early on was the total exclusion of Jews from German society. But as we have seen, the policy of exclusion rested uneasily beside the far more ominous threats of violence. Hitler recognized this tension already in 1919 when he told Adolf Gemmlich that only a political solution to the Jewish question would be lasting and effective. This conflict broke out repeatedly in the intra-party squabbles of the mid-1930s, as the so-called moderates expressed concern that a radical approach to Jews would harm the German economy. By November 1938, this tension had been resolved. At this point, Hitler's malevolent intentions, already revealed in his interviews from the early 1920s and in Mein Kampf and in his speeches in the late 1920s, fully aligned with the anti-Semitism of emotion. The political and legal solution had thoroughly absorbed the anti-Semitism of emotion. The two had now become one. From November 1938 onward, the law would be pogrom-style violence against Jews. This time, however, to be administered not by rowdy SS stormtroopers, but by the cold representatives of Nazi racial violence, the SS. The consummation of this marriage of two kinds of anti-Semitism, the legal form and the pogrom form, occurred 85 years ago on November 9th, 1938. The effects of this marriage, of these two forms of anti-Semitism, reverberate with us until the present day. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to entertain any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you very much.
Testing.
Any comments or questions about this or anything related to it?
Is there any indication that plans were already in place for the violence of Kristallnacht and they were just waiting for the pretext, or did they seize upon this event and then say, get the word out very quickly, and it happened, so completely and efficiently? It seems like it had to be planned.
That's a little yoga here. Yeah, it's an excellent question, and this is a historical question that's come up. Historians have tried to address themselves to. One thing I've tried to emphasize in my presentation this evening was that the Kristallnacht pogrom does not explode like a lightning bolt out of the blue, the clear blue sky. There were already evidences of violence against the Jews in the years leading up to Kristallnacht, especially in the summer of 1938. You have multiple attacks upon Jews. The papers at the time reported this pogrom mood that gripped German cities, especially Berlin, but not exclusively Berlin. But it was especially palpable in Berlin, where Nazi activists were already spoiling for a fight with the Jews. They were attacking Jews at this time. They would actually travel around with bullhorns and harass so-called mixed marriages. So these are Jewish spouse married to a so-called Aryan spouse, and they would smear Jewish stores with the Star of David. They would harass Jews in the streets. They would beat Jews up. All of this was going on in the months leading up to the outbreak of the pogrom. Does that mean that they were planning a major pogrom against the Jews? I don't see any evidence for that specific event. I don't think Kristallnacht per se was planned in advance. But it's like packing all the dynamite together, right? And then taking a fuse and attaching a fuse to it. It's just a matter of time before somebody takes out a match, right? And lights the fuse and detonates the entire mass of dynamite. I think that dynamite was being assembled, especially in the months leading up to the pogrom in November of 1938. Don't forget that many synagogues were already burned to the ground before November of 1938. I do a lot of work, as Professor Michalczyk had mentioned, I do a lot of work in Nuremberg. I teach classes for German and American law students in Nuremberg every summer. And the Nuremberg synagogue was actually burned down in the summer of 1938 on the orders of Julius Streicher, whom Professor Michalczyk is writing about right now, writing a book on. So that was already in the summer of 1938. The Munich synagogue was actually burned to the ground on Hitler's orders in the summer of 1938. This is 3 months before Kristallnacht. So there's already violence in the air. And it was just a matter before that match was lit and the whole thing went up. And that's what happened on November 9th.
So following the events of the Kristallnacht, was there any response from foreign countries or anything like that? Did any news of this get out like beyond like Germany? And if so, like what exactly was the response? Was there like any like reaction to it at all? Or was it just kind of like considered to be just particular to Germany? It's not like anyone else's problem type thing.
Yes, another great question. I mean, there's a broader context here, right? So we have not only Germany, not only Europe, but the world as a whole. And I think other countries were pretty horrified by this. And as a student, you have access to all kinds of databases. So you can get into the New York Times database and go back, pull out the papers, copies of the papers from November 9th, November 10th, November 11th, 1938. You can read the articles. And it's pretty clear that newspapers did cover the event. And there were concerns about Jewish immigration. There was a major conference that was held called the Evian Conference in France that tried to facilitate immigration of Jews out of Germany. There was a feeling that the Jews were really becoming endangered at this point. But of course, what happened at the Evian Conference, there was not an adequate response. The countries of the world did not want to take the Jewish fugitives. And so Hitler interprets that then as being a green light. And it may have conduced to a certain extent to the pogrom itself and to subsequent events too. This belief that we can do what we want to do with the Jews and nobody is going to care. Right? The Germans themselves behaved or reacted passively to the pogrom. They were shaken by it, interestingly enough. They were shaken by the violence of it. But Hitler did not experience any prejudicial effects from the pogrom. And instead, we see this transfer of authority over the Jewish question, as the Nazis called it, and it moves into the hands of the SS, and in particular, Reinhard Heydrich, who will be the head of the Reich Security Main Office. Heydrich is the one who comes up with the idea of the final solution. He's the one who gives it its name, and he becomes the person, the chief. He and Himmler, right, as the head of the SS. He was second in command to Himmler in the SS. And they're the ones then who are going to shepherd the final solution into being in 1941. So this is, as I suggest in my presentation, a really important moment in the Holocaust. Yeah, give you the microphone.
Is there a specific reason why all the countries were like very closed off to having German Jews like enter with like the refugees? Because you mentioned that people weren't very receptive to it. So is there like a specific reason?
Assuredly, we could speculate about reasons for resistance. I mean, in our own country, we have a long history of kind of troubled sort of engagement with immigration. It continues until the present time. And, there was this federal law that was passed in 1924 that actually restricted the numbers of people from Europe who were able to immigrate into the United States. And that directly affected Jews who were trying to get out at that time in the late 1930s. This law was called the Immigration Act of 1924. You may have talked about it in your class. I don't know if you have or not. But if you haven't, take a look at it, because it really put caps, pretty severe caps, on the numbers of fugitives who could make it into the United States. And other countries similarly just did not welcome these Central and eventually Eastern European, once Hitler invaded other countries, Eastern European Jews who were desperate to get out. It's not a glorious chapter from American history by any means. Right? And the opposition continued well into World War II. With members of Congress taking very hard stances against allowing Jews who were literally fleeing for their lives. And the door remained closed to a large extent for these people until about 1943-44 with the creation of the War Refugee Board, but that was late. And as has been pointed out, over 1 million Jews had already been murdered at that point. Yes.
Don't forget FDR's boy, Breckinridge Long.
That's what I was thinking of.
The SOB.
Yeah, Breckinridge Long. Take a look for those of you who are interested in this topic. Just Google Breckinridge Long sometime. There's an excellent book that came out a couple of years ago, published by, I think it's Rutgers Press, called The U.S. and the Holocaust. And it has a lot of the primary source documents, including memoranda of Breckinridge Long. And Breckinridge Long was an anti-Semite. There was no question. I mean, all you had to do is read his writing, and he was opposed to allowing Jews in for that reason. So, anti-Semitism had something to do with it, and no doubt. Yes, round to you.
I can also just say it out loud.
Yeah, okay.
So you kind of discussed how the earliest proof of Hitler's hatred for Jews was in 1919.
Right.
Was there any evidence or research that you've done with his behavioral, his context during his childhood that would suggest that he would create a Nazi party and lead such a destructive event?
Yeah, there's nothing there. Yeah, I'm not a biographer of Hitler. I can recommend all kinds of really good biographies on him. I mean, really scholarly and detailed and thorough biographies, and I've read almost every one of them at this point, I think, and sometimes I've read it 2 or 3 times. And so far as we can tell, nothing there. And there was a poem written by W.H. Auden, September 1939. Professor Michalczyk, you probably know this poem, right? No? Yeah, check it out when you have a chance. I think it's called September 1939, and it's about Hitler. It was written by W.H. Auden, the great English poet. And at one point in the poem, he poses that question: is there anything in the childhood of this man that can explain what happened? And not really. Not so far as we can tell. There was a scholar named Gita Sereni. She's more of a journalist, but she began to write a lot about the Holocaust in her career. She was a really terrific writer. I highly recommend her book, Into That Darkness. But she took up this question. I remember at a conference I attended, and she got all kinds of catcalls and resistance to her theory, but she delivered a talk and claimed that Hitler had been beaten as a child, and that the child abuse somehow affected him psychologically. And then she went on to make an argument that a lot of the major war criminals, the Nazi war criminals, had been abused by their fathers. Right? So there was some sort of a troubled child abuse history that was common, in her view, based on her studies, common to many of these war criminals. Again, I can't vouch for that. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's one idea that I've encountered during my time in this field. Again, you can look her work up too if you wish. Gita Sereni, Sereny, Yeah, Edith Sereni, she's a fine writer. She died just a few years ago. Into That Darkness is one of the very best books. I wrote an article for an online publication, and they asked me to recommend what I thought was the best books. And that was one of them that I recommended. Into That Darkness. It's really superb. Yes, sir.
I read a book some years ago called Hitler's Willing Executioners. Have you read that book?
Yes, I have. Goldhagen.
Yeah. And
Do you want to use the microphone?
okay, sure,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yes, I can hear you.
So I was saying that some years ago, I read a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, and basically the thesis of the book is how much the general population, particularly in Poland, were accomplices in the mass murder, because it was just this not too deep level of anti-Semitism, and it was just a repeat of pogroms from during the Tsarist era. Do you have any opinions about that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Goldhagen's thesis was, I think, a little bit different. I mean, his thesis was that the Germans were peculiarly prone to anti-Semitism, uniquely among European peoples. And he probably talked about some of what you're discussing too, about Polish involvement. But for Goldhagen, the anti-Semitism, he called it eliminationist anti-Semitism. And he believed it was unique to Germany. Now, I think he was wrong. And a lot of scholars believe he was wrong. The Goldhagen's thesis is really not accepted by hardly anybody at this point.
Yeah.
But it was a very high-profile book when it came out. And a lot of people, he was a good writer and could be very persuasive. But there's been a wealth of research done since that time that has really, disproven
So like
his thesis.
when Bismarck ruled Germany, and when Bismarck unified Germany in the late 19th century, and then the Kaisers, was there evidence of deep anti-Semitism in Germany at that time?
No doubt. I mean, of course, you see the rise of the Pan-German League by the late 19th century. So this is a political party that was devoted to primarily to attacking the Jews. That was their calling. That was their remit. That was their central ideology. They built an entire political party around it. But what I think is really meaningful is that this political party that was entirely anti-Semitic, right? If the Germans were burning with hatred for the Jews, why didn't the Pan-Germans do better than they did? At the polls, they actually had to disband the party by 1912 because nobody was voting for it. And what that suggests to me is that a lot of Germans just were not particularly motivated by that idea. That doesn't mean that anti-Semitism wasn't very real. But I remember meeting years ago a scholar, Georg Masse in English. He was a German scholar of the Holocaust, and he actually made a comment at a cocktail party that I attended, and he said that that his intuitions were, just if left to his own devices, that if anybody would have started something like the Holocaust, it would have been the French. And not the Germans. He actually thought the French had a longer tradition of anti-Semitism and were more virulently anti-Semitic than the Germans. That was his view. And you raised the issue of Poland. And the book that I thought of as soon as you said that, it wasn't Hitler's Willing Executioners. It was the book by, I'm blanking on his name. It's called Neighbors.
Grosch? Jan Grosch, was it?
That's it. Yeah, something. Yeah, Jan. Was it Gross? Jan Gross. Yeah, I think it's Gross. Yeah, Jan Gross, who wrote a book called Neighbors. It's an exact examination of a major pogrom that broke out in a little Polish town called Jedwabno. And his argument is very similar to the one that you had mentioned. This was a pogrom. As it turns out, there's been again more research done on this pogrom by Poles against Jews during the war. And as it turns out, the Einsatzgruppen actually had incited the pogrom. At least we have some evidence of that, which is what they did. When they moved in, they would actually incite pogroms within the population against Jews because there was a long history of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. And the Einsatzgruppen were able to harness this in an effort to persuade local people to attack and murder the Jews once the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. Yes, sir.
Do you see any similarities between the awful times that we've been talking about here and what's happening right now?
Yeah, this is such a loaded question. And, it's funny, I took a walk with my wife the other day. We're at this beautiful area not too far from our house, and we were talking about this. And I said, when I go to Boston College and I'm going to Brandeis too on Thursday, I bet you somebody will ask this question, and I'm not even sure how to answer it, right? Because it's so, I tend to be somewhat historicistic in my approach to history, which is to say that I'm very, very leery about trying to draw too many comparisons between contemporary events and what happened under the Nazis in the 20s or the 30s or the 40s. Are there similarities? Sure. I mean, Hamas, if you take a look at some of their documents, some of their founding documents, it's pretty hardcore. You talk about exterminating the Jews. That sort of language sounds very Nazi-like. Do I believe that Hamas is equivalent to the Nazi Party? No, I think the Nazis were uniquely evil. Keep in mind that with the Nazis, you have an organization that seizes control of a government, one of the most modern and sophisticated and technologically advanced governments. If they had been able to hang on a little bit longer, they probably would have developed nuclear fission and developed a bomb. I mean, more Nobel laureates in science per capita than any other country in the world by the 1930s. This is a really advanced country. Don't know that you can say that about Hamas and the kinds of wherewithal they can command. But I'm really leery about trying to draw too many comparisons between what the Nazis did and contemporary events. But obviously, all of us were so horrified by the attacks on civilians, in particular, the unprovoked, gratuitous attacks on men, women, and children across the border. And it's profoundly disturbing, the violence on both sides. More than 10,000 Palestinian civilians who had nothing to do with that attack have been killed thus far. And that's also a matter of great distress. So I dodged your question a little bit. But I've been thinking about it.
One follow-up though.
Not
Not so much a comparison with the Nazis and Hamas, but what's happening in societies around the world.
Oh.
We've got a lot of hatred seemingly flaming up.
We do. Yeah, you heard about the old Chinese curse. The Chinese curse is, may you live in interesting times. And that's the curse, supposedly. We live in very interesting times right now. And quite frankly, I'm not sure what to make of it. It seems as if a lot of this blood and soil ideology has been staging a comeback in recent years. And you see it in one country after another, including in our own country. So we're not even immune to this. My wife and I, again, were just talking about this the other day, and there's this spate now of anti-Semitic attacks as well as anti-Arab attacks in the United States, also in Europe. And not that long ago, it was anti-Asian sentiment stirred up during COVID, when people were trying to blame Asians for the COVID virus. And before that time, if you look at the FBI's statistics, it was gay people. Gay people were the primary victims of hate crimes up until very recently. But it seems like this kaleidoscopic shifting of identities, but there's always some group that absorbs the hatred of certain people in society, and it's extremely distressing. I was in Europe this summer in July, and the Alternative for Germany, which is kind of their hard right, I would call it a neo-Nazi or neo-fascist organization. I'm sure they would bristle at that, claim that they have nothing to do with neo-Nazism. But so far as I can tell, it's a neo-fascist movement, but they're doing extremely well at the polls. They're expected to become, one of the dominant parties at the next election if the polling holds true. So I'm very concerned about what's going on in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. But these are kind of troubling times we're living in, and I hope that our young people, our students, just understand this is not normal, right? I mean, this is not something you have to accept. We can change this. We don't have to accept this. We can be better than that. Yeah, you're welcome. Other comments? Quick, yes.
Thank you.
Of course.
There's a lot of belief that Hitler took advantage of the economic distress during the Weimar period and the desire of Germans to look for scapegoats for their malaise. Had the Weimar Republic been more stable and the reparations not been as severe after Versailles, do you think Hitler still would have rose to power?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting counterfactual. There were so many things that had to come together for Hitler to become chancellor. And I don't know whether in your class you've talked about this, about extraordinary confluence of circumstances. The way that, I mean, his ability to become Reichschancellor was the essential event, right? So what enabled him to become Reichschancellor? Well, in part, what you're saying is correct. He rode the wave of people's concern about the Great Depression. But you also had, I think, an overly empowered president, a Reichspresident in Hindenburg, who was conned into, or duped into believing that he should appoint Hitler Chancellor, and that once he did that, he and his allies would be able to control Hitler and essentially tap the Nazis for their electoral support and just use him as a puppet, which may be the dumbest thing anyone's done in the 20th century. Right? It's the idea, yeah, let's bring him into government, right? Make him the Reichschancellor, then we can control him. Well, that's a level of hubris that I think was off the charts. You subtract that, there were a lot of people within the government who did not want to bring Hitler on board, but there was a willingness to do that. Could Weimar have been made more stable? Maybe. Go back and rewrite Article 48 of the Constitution, which enabled the Reich president to essentially bypass the Reichstag and to pass laws by emergency decree to essentially suspend the Constitution. So maybe at the founding of the country in summer of 1919, had they decided to get rid of that emergency provision, then maybe that would have prevented Hindenburg from being able to prepare essentially the foundation of what became a dictatorship, which Hitler was able to preside over. Yeah, I mean, these are difficult questions. None of us know for certain. The economic distress was critical, though. I'm actually of the view that you subtract the Great Depression from the equation. I don't think the door opens to Hitler, and history would have taken a different direction. Of course, if Hitler had been accepted in 1908 into the Vienna Academy of the Fine Arts, had his application been successful, then he would have become an artist, which is what he wanted to do from day one, and maybe may not have been tempted to go into politics later on. So he would have sold his postcards and his paintings, and who knows? He may have had an exhibit even here in the United States at some point. I don't know if he had the talent to do that, but he would not have gone into politics. Other questions or comments, Professor Michalczyk?
Yeah, if we're connecting it to other times and other countries, what I see just recently is with Rachel Maddow's new book called Prequel, because we rarely see ourselves as not the good guys. But her prequel, her podcast, her book, and she's making a motion film out of it, says that we in the United States were equally anti-Semitic, but we didn't carry it out, starting with people like Henry Ford, the industrialist, and a lot of the eugenics people who gradually moved from eugenics to some of the fascism to make it a better society. But what I found interesting is that Professor Charlie Gallagher, I don't know if you know him, he's in our history department. He just wrote a book called Nazis in Copley Square. You're out of town, it's about 20 minutes from BC.
You've read the book?
And, I read the book, talked with him, and he spoke a couple of times about how at this time of even the pogrom at Kristallnacht, we had Nazis in our Israeli consulate, in our German consulate. We had sort of deputies all over, and that we were very, very fascist in many ways. And the group that he specifically talked about was called the Christian Front. Father Charles Coughlin the radio priest from Michigan, was very anti-Semitic. And he would command an audience of 15, 20,000 in whether Madison Square Garden or his open air ceremonies. And he preached against the Jews. He called them the money changers in the temple, including calling President Roosevelt Franklin D. Roosevelt, to make sure that people wanted to see a connection with the policies of our government. So, we look at Nazi Germany, during this period and we say, they were very, very anti-Semitic. Well, we don't have clean hands. And that's what Rachel Maddow's point is, that with the Christian Front, an armed group that was going to take over the government was patterned on the front in Spain. It was the Popular Front, the Frente Popular, and they had violence, they had all these tactics in mind, plus an arsenal. So they were going to take over the government. So Rachel Maddow's podcast and her book really deal with this period that in 1930s, at this time, we had a big fascist movement going. And people rarely talk about that because we saw the buildup, with anti-Semitism to Nazi Germany. So, I think it's worth looking into. The book prequel, it's on the bestseller now. I'm not getting a commission, but I'm hoping that Father Charlie Gallagher from our history department will be able to put out his film because someone bought the rights for his book, and I think it would make excellent viewing to help us understand what we were like during this time of the 30s, the build-up to World War II. So that's my editorial comment for the day. For guest speaker.
I think there was a film made about this, was there not? A feature film not too long ago. I think it's called Amsterdam. Has anyone seen this film? With the woman who was in, what's her name? Emma Stone, I think her name was in it. And anyway, it actually talks about this history a little bit. So check it out when you have a chance. Amsterdam, it's called. Other comments or questions from anybody? About anything related to what we've been talking about, or about the class that you're taking? Anything stimulates your thinking about this? No? Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say that I'm 76 years old. I consider that I had a pretty good education. I went to University of Michigan, both undergrad and for a social work degree. Retired now, and this is the best. And I'm Jewish, and this is the best Kristallnacht talk I've ever heard in my life in terms of putting. What you did, wait, I'm gonna say something else that you're not back like. I'm building you up, I'm sorry. But it was the best talk that I've heard in my whole lifetime, including on TV and different things and putting things together. But one thing that you said about this not being normal, I'm not sure that it isn't not normal. I'm not sure that I was just lucky enough to live in this country at a really good time. And that I want to say that going to this class and everything, you just have to be vigilant and vote and do whatever you can to make this life the best it can be for all peoples.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Comments, questions? Thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to staying in touch with you. If you have any questions or comments or want to stay in touch with me, by all means, just let me know.
I could be the liaison.
Exactly, the intermediary. Thank you
We're
again.
very grateful.